Всем привет. Я сегодня буду
Good evening.
рассказывать про утечки в
I
open source
will
проектах.
talk about
Это острая проблема на самом деле.
leaks in open source
С,
projects.
собственно,
That's a burning issue.
описание того, о чем буду говорить.
Let me start with a description of what I will talk about. First,
Как их
why they
можно
happen,
предотвратить,
how can you overcome them,
ну и,
how can you
наконец,
trace
как
them,
реагировать.
and finally, how you respond to
Но перед
them.
этим пара слов обо мне.
A few words about
Меня зовут
myself.
Антон Фахретдинов,
I'm
я
Anton
являюсь экспертом в
Fakhretdinov.
разработке сока крупного банка.
I'm an expert at a SOC of a large bank.
2 года на L2
I'm also a student, and for 2 years at SOC L2, I
мы разрабатываем.
research GitHub for any leaks from our company.
GitHub.
A few words about terminology. GitHub. I think everyone who has survived it up to this moment know what this is, but essentially this is a social network for developers that publishes source code of projects. GitHub
В виде GitHub GIST.
has
У себя в проектах внутренних мы называем его глистом.
GitHub.
И это является некоторым открытым буфером обмена.
This is
Репозиторий — это архив.
sort of a paste bin. Repositories are archives that contain source code and information about developers and the project itself. And finally, commits are the
Почему я
history of changes in a project.
с термина GitHub?
And why did I start with GitHub?
Сейчас GitHub является
Because right now GitHub is the leader in this area in publishing source code.
на 23-й год.
You can see that
Которую привели GitHub.
as of 2023, according to GitHub, more than 100 million users
Из них,
do developments with them,
естественно, делают какие-то свои открытые репозитории.
and most of them create open repositories.
Позапрошлом, и за
There was 300 million the last but 1 year, and then just last year there was 100 new repositories.
для потенциальной утечки
You can see that it's a great scope for potential leaks.
коммитов.
More than 310 commits were done to open repositories, and almost all of them were accepted.
Понимаю, что это
Understanding
опасно
that
постоянно
there could be a security issue
за репозиториями, в которых что-то все утекает, решили
looking after repositories, GitHub decided to create a Git Guardian
исследование всех открытых репозиториев,
that reviews all open repositories for leaks
паролей
of tokens, passwords,
и
etc.
цифры, которые приводит Git Guardian,
And the numbers by Git Guardian last year
более 13 миллионов утечек
are really amazing. More than 13 million leaks were identified,
никак не были устранены.
and most of them were not addressed
владельцев репозитория.
after Git Guardian notified the repository holders.
Судя по отчету, который он предоставляет,
According to their report,
репозитории российских разработчиков.
Git Guardian does not review repositories of Russian developers, so we have to be even more careful. So what is leaked according to Git Guardian? It's quite straightforward. Passwords, tokens, encryption keys, certificates,
И
the usual suspects.
переключилось. Настолько это массовая проблема, что
And it's such a big problem that
Twitter, Facebook
even large companies are affected, such as Twitter or Facebook.
слить исходные коды своих проектов.
A couple of years they had leaks of their source codes. Mercedes-Benz this year published in their open source projects their GitHub token. And thus, many people got access to the internal repositories of companies. Microsoft, among large players, published a token that led to a confidential data of 38 terabytes. And not just these companies, there are other large international companies, including in open source projects, that had leaks in their repositories.
Что ж, с GitHub понятно, а у нас еще есть Gitverse.
Okay,
Классный open source проект российских разработчиков.
we understand GitHub, but we also have Gitverse. This is a tool by Russian developers. We certainly need it, but currently it's quite at an early stage. Finding repositories was perhaps as difficult as finding leaks in those depositories. But currently, many companies register their accounts with Getverse, and attackers may simply map accounts from Gitverse to GitHub and get an understanding that this is a Russian company that is doing some development. Okay, we have appreciated the scale of the problem. Let us discuss the reasons. The reasons are, in general, clear. The potential leak spots are also quite straightforward. Often they happen in open source companies. This is the sweet spot for attackers to see if a company has on GitHub, and if yes, then maybe they left a token or an SSH of a key or something like that. There may also be a leak in open source projects that a company supports. It is a good initiative that certainly helps the industry. However, sooner or later, some developer may accidentally leak their internal access credentials to CI/CD and Nginx on in Linux with millions of commits, which are verified very quickly and most likely would pass the verification, because, as we have seen, many do pass. And finally, the accounts of the developers themselves can become the source of a leak. Their pet projects, or maybe the projects they copied from their previous job. Again, very clear why this is happening. First and foremost, because of a lack of awareness about information security. And then again, CI/CD is that we love and that we aim for, often doesn't contain the checks that should be there in terms of the leaks in the code that published on GitHub. And an indirect problem is the lack of monitoring and audit of GitHub itself. If we think about leaks, if we don't think about leaks, we can overlook a whole channel of potential leaks. Okay, we have made the problem clear. What are the solutions? As InfoSec people, we like processes. We have processes everywhere. And by the way, here we need a process as well. And the process of continuous learning, the constant reminding that when developers publish something on the internet, they have to be cautious. The process of proper configuration of CI/CD. We need to make sure that nothing undesired goes through it. And finally, some means of monitoring and response for leaks when they happen post factum. The process of monitoring, as always in InfoSec, can be done two ways, whether paid outsource or free open source. And it's up to everyone to decide. Let's start with open source. And I will discuss the benefits and disadvantages of both. Open source is good. There are great projects such as Trufflehog, Git Secrets, Git Leaks, and Deep Secret by the guys from Avito, for example. These things analyze code and find leaks, supported by the community, and I like them. But they share a common problem. It is difficult to build a process out of any of these or all of these, because they just get as input some repositories, some files, and they provide as input, as output some information, whether there's a leak or not. So there has to be someone in the company to visit GitHub even before they have their morning coffee and see whether there are any new leaks. it takes quite a lot of time. A person would have to look at every suspicious repository, would have to check for every target word that is remotely related to the company. So it's not a good thing, and it requires an FTE, if it's a large company, to just analyze GitHub. Apparently, commercial solutions could help, and they are available. There are quite a few of them. They have all the benefits that you don't need a person. They will find everything. They will respond themselves. However, there are disadvantages that still human involvement is required to inspect that this is really a leak. And another thing is that the leaks end up in third-party hands, and such solutions are far from being inexpensive, and it would be difficult to get approval for them than an antivirus or a CM. So in my company, I came up with my own path of the samurai, developing my own open source solution that would address all the issues. Well, it doesn't address all the issues, but we liked what we got. My small open source utility every day, or rather every 3 hours, analyzes GitHubs, simply doing a search using the API to find new repositories, any changes, or it reviews the accounts of our developers that we have identified, downloads that, sends it through the Truffle Hog or Deep Secret, those utilities, and comes up with a final report that the first-line analyst gets. They can review it, they can make sure that there is no leak or there is a leak, and if it's a leak, they could hit a button on the ERP system and it would raise an incident to respond. And another important benefit is about running on-prem. We are a bit paranoid, so we run everything on-prem. There are disadvantages that you still need an InfoSec analyst, and the response we had to do ourselves. And the accuracy is perhaps lower than from commercial services, but we can live with that. Okay, I have discussed monitoring, and the final part is response. GitHub has documentation which is very clear about what's to be done, very straightforward. First, you need to address the repository owner and try to solve things peacefully. Then, failing that, to conduct an investigation to gather evidence that this is a serious leak that could lead to an incident, and send it to GitHub. They would review it in California or wherever they are, and they would decide whether that's a leak or not. Most likely, they would rule it to be a leak. They are quite meticulous about it, and we like them for that. When we had a case when we found a serious leak of a code to a banking service, we have been able to negotiate with them and sort things out in just 5 hours' time. But you've got to be very clear what is a leak and requires a prompt response and what is not. A leak is account credentials, access tokens, documentation. That's a question mark, because some may be seen as a leak, other things not necessarily. And personal information, passport details, social security number. Whereas what may not be seen as a leak, it could be internal company IPs, references to the company brand, and some content which is related to the company. Okay, I started by saying that open source is good, and I want to repeat that. Open source is great. So I decided to publish my own script for a couple of thousand lines so that everyone could join the development of this project and to try to implement it for themselves, to see if it monitors well. And I invite you to take a look. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I will be happy to answer your questions, and remember to secure your data. After all, it is the oil of the 21st century.
Ждем. Когда тут интернет прогрузится.
Waiting for the internet.
Да.
There are no questions at the moment.
Спасибо за доклад.
Thank you for your presentation.
Вы рассмотрели вопрос с одной стороны, то есть
You
вы уже что-то запушенное.
looked at the issue from one side. When you look at something that has been pushed, you look at the repositories by your employees, etc. What about implementing pre-commit hooks?
Да, спасибо за вопрос.
Thank you for your question.
Моя как ИБшная часть тут немного подальше, потому что
As information security, this is not quite our domain. This is more for OPSECs or DevSecOps. It is up to them to create good hooks that would review any repositories that go outside of the company. There's a good thing that we don't use, though, GitHub Actions. It's free, and out of the box, it is already configured to validate the code for leaks. I would very much recommend it if you were to develop your own open source project. And I don't think I can recommend any commercial solutions.
Давайте еще один вопросик.
Let's take another question.
Это ваше решение, но
This is your solution, but under the hood it uses some other tools, I understand, and monitoring happens for the leak of password tokens, etc. Or can it be configured to find leaks of source code, because the source code in itself can be valuable without any tokens or passwords? Indeed, this is a good question. I didn't talk much about how my utility works, and it works in the following way. Of course, it monitors the repositories and accounts that we already know, and it also searches GitHub using keywords very similar to what a specialist or an attacker would do. We do it through API. And we have many keywords, dozens of them, that we use to find lots of garbage. Literally, I have thousands of exceptions, and I know thousands of repositories with Linux kernels. I come across them very often, and by the way, there are many leaks there. So, yes, my solution uses target words, and thus to find the repositories that you haven't looked at previously. And this is how it happens often. Almost all leaks that we found, and there were some 20 in the 6 months' time, all of them were in the repositories that we didn't know about. And in all of them, our developers were involved in this or that way. And so simply by doing a keyword search, you can find things. And I don't think of any other way of an attacker finding such a repository on GitHub. other than by search. Thank you for your presentation. A question about your project. Do you intend to develop it to a commercial level? And if yes, do you have a roadmap?
Насчет коммерческого уровня, честно скажу,
In terms of taking it to a commercial level, honestly, I didn't give it too much thought. Well, I did think about it, because I spent quite a lot of time on it, but I didn't really give it too much thought. But I think I intend to develop it as an open source. I do have a roadmap to develop it with some optimization, because currently it leaves much to be desired, and potentially developing a web-based GUI interface so that this large database that it gathers could be reviewed in a visual format. And currently, it has collected a few thousand of entries, and it is becoming quite difficult to review. But these are plans for the future. I do hope that I'll come across someone who could help me do it. I didn't really think about the commercial path.
Кажется, вопросов нет?
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. Is there an option of code signature for a company so that your information security guys could easily find that code? I don't know, maybe to sign the code with some hash so that you could search for that hash in GitHub and to find a leak. Do you think that is possible, or is it just a dream? Thank you for the question. It's an interesting question. I didn't really think about it, because we are a very big company, and it's almost impossible to mandate our developers to do something like that. Anyway, GitHub looks or searches by keywords, and it skips dots, it skips @ So if you type in a word that is easily identifiable, yes, I think it is possible. But I think I would do that in a more discreet way. For example, by mentioning in all projects some phrase or some big word that you couldn't attribute to a particular company. And the developers wouldn't know themselves why they would do that as an InfoSec paranoid. And then GitHub would come up with relevant search results. The name of the company in which I work only has a few characters in its name. But even so, it can be searched quite well, even though the search returns quite a lot of garbage. According to my assessment, you need at least 10 characters to avoid this garbage that is returned in your search results. Sadly, I have to process quite a lot of garbage.